Just making sure we've got, there we go. Okay, we've got all of them. Hi. Thank you very much for coming this evening. My name is Barrett Sullyholt. I can see, yes, actually he can see the panel. He can see the panel, and at the question and answer, we will be directing the camera towards the question and answer, but we figured since at first we're going to be engaging in discussion up here on stage that it would behoove us to have the panelists being able to face each other. So there is a strange kind of experience happening here where he can see them, but you can see him. And they can see him. This is Humberto Duque, is one of the artists, if they look at the screen. So you guys can kind of look, but he can see you through there. So we'll try it. We'll see if it works. If not, it'll be good material. Thank you for coming tonight to beg, borrow, and steal 4 contemporary views on failure. We rarely air moments of failure within our practices, and I'd like to thank the participating artists ahead of time for allowing me to address them as experts on the subject. I think that we will find an understanding of failure and how we engage with its inevitability, that this will create parameters for exploring how to deal ethically not only with our environments of the social, political, and ecological, but with ourselves. So I'd like to say this is Barry Anderson, all the way over here. And I'm not going to do a big introduction, but I would like to connect the people here on stage with the works in the Temporary Institute of Emancipated Objects, which surrounds us. Barry's work is on the multi-channel video installations. We also have Brett Day Windham. In this show, you will see her tassels and the collage work that you may have seen already. We have Whitney Lynn, the Quincy outside of our gallery, as well as the balloon performer and bricks. These are the works she's engaged with. And Humberto Duque has provided us with the Howl piece in the foyer to the cloakroom with a video piece, as well as this, the piece in the back of the East Gallery with the Mylar blanket and the mitts. So just to kind of give you a clue as to the work here, we'll get into their own work and how it's developed in a second here. There are many bits, sound bites, quips, and quotes on the integral relationship between failure and success. And indeed, by devoting an entire panel of artists to discuss failure may seem like a cheeky and roundabout way to discuss how to succeed. Most definitions of failure imply the negation of success, a non-performance, below normal qualities or quantities deterioration, and the inability for expectations to be met. Success, on the other hand, performs, meets, and exceeds expectations, and endures. In regards to the theme of our spring lecture series, which this panel kicks off, Ethics and Practice, Approaches to the Contemporary, I would like us to keep in mind Isabel Stenger's definition of practice, that it is not the activity of an individual or the product of that activity, it is the ingredient without which neither that activity nor this product would exist as such. So in this discussion of the relationship of failure to or within art-making practices, I would like to begin by asking each of our panelists, and by means of introduction in a sense, how they approach what could be considered failure as a warping of expectations within practice as a productive activity. For instance, and we'll start with Brett, the question I'd like to pose to the panel by means of, we'll go through each one of them, is in your practice, is failure something to be embraced, managed, or forgotten? All three combination?
Is this working? It is perfect. I think it's all three, but the predominant one for me is management, because before you even get started, practically you have to accept that failure is going to be a big part of any risk-taking that you do in the studio. So managing that failure and figuring out how to, I think management with your other words are embracing and letting go. So you manage it so that you can embrace it, and then once it's past, you can let it go. I think for me, it's a combination of those. And if that doesn't happen, I'm probably not doing something right.
No, I'd like to get back to the specifics in your practice, but Barry?
Yeah, on my end, I agree with Brett in some ways in my own practice. One thing that's slightly different about mine working in video is that because of the technological component, I have two prongs of potential failure. One is artistic, and like any artist, taking risk, not expecting everything to work out as I intend, and that's a very elusive definition of failure, where I don't even like the word even. It's just sometimes I like them better than not, or they're more effective than not. But on the other side, the one that I have to manage and never forget is the effect of the equipment. I'm heavily reliant on off-the-shelf electronics that evolve constantly, hourly it seems. The technology's changing, and that it always fails at some point. This show is no exception. We had a problem with the 4-channel. Not a major problem, but I knew, that was a potential. So if anything, I kind of, I take it all as much in stride as I can and expect it, and expect to manage it and kind of live with it in a way. And I'm sure we're going to get deeper into the minutiae of that, but yeah.
Whitney?
Hi.
Hi.
So for me, failure is all about expectation. And I think it's important to distinguish the difference between expectation in terms of fabrication versus expectation in terms of conception. And so I think it's important to embrace that a piece can shift or change or evolve, but then it's equally important to be able to step back and try to evaluate what it is that the piece becomes. And so I think ultimately for me, whether failure is embraced or negated really has to do with the character of the underlying project.
Great. Humberto?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, actually, can we get a little bit more sound on Humberto?
Because I'm going to start by saying something shocking, but I can't hear you very well.
Oh, it's so quiet. It's so quiet. Hold on one second.
It's a little the audio is a little broken down.
There we go.
And I couldn't hear the first question, and then the rest of the conversation was a little. I heard 50%. I can figure it out though, but.
I can repeat it too.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So my question was, in your practice, is failure something to be embraced, managed, or forgotten? Combination, singular?
I think definitely it's something to be embraced. I think it's inevitable. It's something that you have to consider and that you have to deal with for the rest of your life, for the rest of your art practice. I mean, just part of the job, I think. Yeah.
Excellent.
I actually consider my life to be a complete failure, but when it comes to this part of the making art, it's just something that you have to work with all the time, and it's just you have to cope with it, I think.
Yeah, and actually I'd like to go right back to Brett in talking about management of failure and how, and with what Humberto just said about having it be something that you always have to cope with, that you're always going to have to deal with, and management is very strong for you, like you said. So if you could tell us a little bit about how you manage possible failure, I'd really appreciate it.
Humberto, can you hear us?
Yeah,
A little bit?
It's weird though, because when we made the tests a couple of hours ago, it was perfect.
Uh-huh, of course.
The image was great and the audio was great. Now it's just a little weaker, I think.
I think Barrett planned it that way.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about something about failure.
So I think
Yes.
to answer your question, how I manage the specter of failure in the studio, and I'm interested hearing everybody else talk about it, because I think the pathos in Humberto's work and then the way the conceptual remove from failure, and then the technology is so different from the way I work, and I think it really makes a full picture. But For me, for making sculpture primarily, I always feel like I walk into the studio empty-handed, and it's terrifying. I don't have a technology or a material that I'm gonna go to, so each piece I've learned has to dictate itself to me, and then I have to manage that and try to not let it get away from me or turn into something that I'm sorry I made. I hate it when artists talk about the work made me do it, or like, I never wanted to make work like this and I had to. Like, I think that you can, like, there's some management control, right? But so one way that I've developed that I talked about in my workshop here yesterday for managing this specter of failure or the overwhelmingness that can consume you when you first walk into your studio and it's cold, is that every day on my way to the studio, wherever my studio is, I pick up a single object. And I've been doing it for 5 years. And that object collection has grown and evolved and has become this piece called the Rosary, where I add that object to a string. And I think it's about 110 feet long now. And I've shown it quite a few times. The first time I showed it, objects were offered to it. There was a joint added and a lighter and a wrapped condom. Like, people were adding like it was some sort of weird altar. And then the next time, things were stolen from it by children with a blade and taken to a pawn shop. So it's become this thing that allows me to go into the studio and feel like I have this talisman in my hand. And then when the piece goes out into the world, it acts, I guess, as a talisman for other people and a way to read my work. So that practice of like this burnishing myself, like bolstering myself up with this object, allows me to go in with a little something to start with, a little busy work.
Right.
Yeah.
And with Whitney, your practice diverges a little bit from Brett's, where you will engage often with performance, and I think that there can be a different level of expectation, like you were saying, with the failure often resides within how you set up expectations. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that. We had kind of a moment of that with building the Quincy, which is the snow structure outside of the gallery. And I was wondering if you could just kind of speak about how you go into performances with expectations and how you, whether or not it's like a management of failure, or if it's there, how that works for you.
Yeah, well, I think for this exhibition, I just really wanted to make something new and then hopefully something that was site responsive in some way. And so with the outdoor snow shelter, part of it is probably just because I have no experience with snow, and I thought that it was always going to be snow on the ground in January in Denver. And then when I told Courtney that I wanted to build an igloo, she's like, told me that there might not actually even be snow, and then it evolved into getting the snow cone machine, and then roped students here into helping me build it, so I'm very grateful for that. But I think it's a general sort of premise was set up, and then whether or not we were actually able to build it didn't necessarily matter. And that in particular outside was about that process and the social aspect. And I think that with the performer tonight, that I was saying earlier that I had to go through a lot of really angry clowns in email before I was able to find Ben Heath, who was our performer, and he was really just perfect because he understood what we were trying to do. And then he actually tonight came up with attaching the things together. I thought that it would be a pile, and so there was these unexpected things that I think is something that for me I embrace that.
And with you, Humberto, if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. So with the objects that you use in your artwork, they're often intended for other things that you then subvert. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you work with the ready-made, so to speak, and engaging it with other already produced things, and if you find how you would find failure in, or maybe not, if you could just speak to the objects and their subversion and how that kind of rides with you.
They just mentioned something interesting that I'd like to talk about.
Absolutely.
And it's expectations. I like to work a lot with that. I think that's an inherent part of my process, or the result of what I do, actually. Because I don't know, for instance, when you see the work, the miler on the floor and the fans, it's about just, you know, like building an expectation, but in the end, there's nothing really happens, you know. So it might be not only like disappointing, but also it's about dealing with failure. You know, you expect something to happen, but in the end, nothing really goes on, and nothing happens. So I'm interested in creating that feeling for the audience to experience, not only with that work, but with a lot of the pieces that I've done. And I thought that'd be like an interesting way to talk about failure in this case. And about the ready-mades, I don't know. It's also like kind of random. Sometimes I'm sitting around in the studio, and something just unexpected triggers, you know, like what's going to become an essential part of a work.
Right. And then I'd like to kind of engage Barry in this next question. You know, talking about this in practice, and you kind of mentioned that initially in the first question. But another question of failure and like accepting for it or managing it or forgetting it or embracing it happens in this practice. But also within art making, we have the larger framework of the public setting of art in showing work and responding to an audience. And I wonder if you would share with us, Barry, some of your, I mean, because I know there's maybe a few anecdotes or stories or whatever with things where you've thought things have failed,
Right.
and that they might be failing at this moment, or I wonder if you could speak to that, like presenting the work and how it's received.
Sure. Yeah, the one anecdote that I mentioned earlier today that I'm glad it happened early-ish in my career. This was something that happened in graduate school when I was first working in video, and it was the best lesson I could have had. In that, this might sound strange, but it was a lesson both in trusting myself and never trusting myself at the same time. It was a lesson in just making art and letting it like fail and succeed kind of as it goes. But I did this piece in graduate school where I used to obsessively just kind of shoot video and not really think about it. Somewhat like Humberto was saying, like nothing's really happening. I'm just shooting things where there's not really anything happening in the shot. And I did this video of a pigeon that I put up in a graduate critique, mainly because I just had to show a lot of work, and I'm just kind of, well, this one's kind of interesting maybe, but there's not much to it. And I thought it was the weakest of the lot. And it got a really good response in that, and everyone's like, this is the best piece you've done this year. And I'm like, okay. I'm not quite seeing it. You know, we talked about it, I was like, okay, that's fine. I'm not feeling it the same way you guys are. I wouldn't call it a failure, but it wasn't exciting me in that way. And as a couple of years progressed out of grad school and all that, it would be part of my portfolio. And eventually it became my most shown work. You know, it's literally been shown around the world. My first ever museum purchase was of that piece. It's now in 3 museums. So what the hell do I know? I mean, it's one of those. It's like I could have easily just let it slide past me and looked at it and said, that's kind of interesting, but I'm thinking about something else. The other pieces I showed in the crit that never even saw the light of day outside the crit. So, you know, that's where it's like, what is a failure and not? Or what's a success? The better way to put it is I never thought it was a failure, but where was the success? You know, the antithesis of it. What was the piece that people were responding to, that the audience was enraptured with? And I wasn't seeing it at the time. I've learned to understand it more. And it's happened to me many other times as well. So I am more like just, I guess, like I say, trust myself and not try to second guess an audience too much, hoping. Because the worst thing, one thing I'll add is we move on, I realized as we were just talking, the one failure in my mind any artist could probably agree on is people not caring. It's putting something on the wall and just no one caring. You know, that could be seen as a failure in a lot of ways. The art might be great, but, you know. So that's all I hope for. That's really the one failure I don't want, is for someone just not to care, you know.
Does the rest of the panel want to follow up on that? Perhaps this relates back to the effectivity question of, like, maybe this is more where we're shaping the idea of failure and success as the idea of the effective.
I mean, I think a lot of artists have had that experience where you don't know which work is going to be received. I mean, that's kind of the piece that I make every day.
Right,
I thought I would never show it. And I had a piece also that I made in graduate school that looked like a poop. Like, it literally was like, I made it in the middle of the night. I had no idea what it was. It was brown. It was hideous. It had these, like, it's so ugly. It has these pinstripes painted on the side. I don't know why. Everybody loves it. They love it so much. And I don't know why, but I let people see it because I think there's like a pathos or like something that people, some empathetic valve that opens. Like, can you have empathy with this work? Can you connect with it in some way? And it's the most embarrassing sometimes, but like, you know, and I think that conflicts failure with success in an interesting way. Like, you're humiliated, but it's working.
Yeah, right.
Have you had an experience like that, Whitney?
I've never made a poop for art.
I didn't mean to be fair. I
thought you had to in grad school. I thought
it was an elongated stool, like a stool that you sit on. But it was a different type of stool. I made the wrong kind of stool.
You had a really major rewire in the middle of the night.
Well, I had last year I had the city of Reno asked if I would do a project for their city hall gallery, or not their gallery, the lobby of the city hall. And I don't know if anybody's ever been to Reno, but it's an interesting place. And so in doing some research about it, sort of looking at the gold rush history, but then going up there for a couple of trips, was just really struck by how depressed the place was. And so it's trying to refigure right now, I think, of the casinos are failing, and so what can Reno be now? And then half the lights in the casinos don't work, and so trying to figure out how to make work about this. And so I came up with, there's a series of 45 drawings that are all We Buy Gold signs, because there's a lot of pawn shops and We Buy Gold shops up there. And then I made a incandescent light and neon sign that alternates from flashing wannabe to has been. And as we were installing the sign that would have been in front of the City Hall chamber, the plug was pulled, and I had to bring it back home with me to San Francisco. But they still showed the drawings, and I felt like the content was the same in both. So it was this sort of interesting thing of, you know, was it the form or the content that was the friction, and that even though it failed and that it wasn't shown where it was originally intended, that, you know, for me it's kind of that maybe that's what I was trying to do in the first place.
And Humberto, have you had an experience of this ilk?
Can't remember one in particular. Not that I consider that all my work has been successful. I would never say that. On the contrary, but it's just that maybe not in the same way as you just have mentioned. But I totally agree with Barry when he says that the worst possible imaginable thing that can happen to you is for someone to just ignore your work and or not get anything. You know, that's just going beyond failure, I think. Otherwise, it's just, as we have said before, and it's a part of the process. Just a part of the process that's inevitable.
Right. So I guess another thing within this kind of discussion that we are generating of effectivity and perceived effectivity, evaluation. I guess, is there a part, and we've just kind of talked about it in like this larger framework of when the artwork is viewed, and we've also talked about it as personal failures that, you know, have been perceived in another way. But do you have something to say about how to recognize what's becoming effective? And in that question, though, is also, do you know when you're failing, so they're kind of like, it's kind of like two sides of this one question of recognizing what's working and what you can see is becoming effective. And is that something to even keep in your mind while in your practice, or is it something that just resides within the effectivity of yourself? Does this question kind of make sense? It's kind of like pulling these together and kind of trying to find a way to articulate a recognition of not necessarily specifically failure and success, because that might not necessarily enter into the specifics of what you're articulating when you're thinking to yourself. But when you're creating or when you're practicing your everyday as well as art making practice, and we've brought up attention as well. How do you go about, you know, creating this type of environment for yourself to play, to be free? Is it a matter of freedom or playing, or?
Do you want to start with me?
Sure, why not?
You're looking at me. Well, I thought what Barry said earlier about trusting yourself and not trusting yourself, and maybe it's, for me, I don't know if this is for you, but like an intuitive balance, where yes, no, and you just vacillate back and forth. I think that's really important, and then experience. I think that you gain that understanding of going back and forth with trust from experience and realizing that you don't know nothing and you don't know everything. But aside from that, for me, every day in the studio is different. You know, I might have a terrible day in the studio and read a book. I might make a one-day sculpture just to pull myself out of a slump. But in terms of judging success or failure, it's so intuitive, and it's like hour to hour. Like you just keep.
So do you find it necessary to step away? Like with the reading of the book in the studio? Like some sort of engagement with the crowd?
I guess if I'm really frustrated and something is really not, like something materially is really not working, if a mold isn't setting up or wood isn't behaving the way I want it to, or something is falling apart and it's just frustrating, it's nice to take a break. It's pretty basic human, I think. But yeah, I don't know. It's very intuitive for me. I think the way that I work is different because I don't have, there's not a finish line, like there's not a drawing that I'm trying to replicate. It's a really intuitive process. So it's hard. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say in the process of actually making the imagery, I'm almost exactly like you. I look at it as incredibly intuitive, and that's what I desire it to be. So I'm the same. I stop and watch movies or whatever, you know. But in asking how you really codify it, again, kind of going back to what I said first, probably the clearest way in my medium that I can see failure in the face is there is no video, which is always a threat I have. Due to the process, which I won't go into, sometimes it takes, when I say I'm ready to go with this video, sometimes it takes weeks for it to process through and be ready, and I fight time. Time is my medium and my enemy constantly. So I do fight that when it comes down to the wire of a show. Thankfully, this one was cool. It was all good. But, you know, that's where I see failure looming in my face all the time. But it's still like what Brett was saying, it's still history, trusting myself, trusting that I know my tools the best I can, that I can work through it. And sometimes it is just simply sitting here going, it'll happen. It'll happen. You know, it's got to happen. I mean, you did that. You didn't have stuff show up in UPS, right? The show's going to happen.
Yeah.
There's going to be a way it's going to happen. That's the biggest trust, is we will put a show on, you know?
Yeah.
There will be artwork on the wall, you know? But other than that, again in the studio, it's all
I mean,
play and intuition.
think
And,
that
that stroke failed, or why did I
Yeah.
put that image in there? Get that out. It's things like that. It's not big, epic failures or successes necessarily.
I think that intuition allows us to like recover when something like that
Right,
goes wrong,
exactly.
when something doesn't arrive, or something
Right,
doesn't
right.
Like you have to be a problem solver.
Right.
Does intuition factor into either of your practices, Humberto or Whitney? Like with the effectiveness, or you can answer the original question too, it's fine.
You can
Go for it,
ahead with
Humberto, take it
with
away.
if you want.
So I'll say something.
Go for it, Whitney.
Go for it.
Okay, I have to think about intuition. I don't know if I have an answer for that yet, but then I think maybe just responding to what you all were saying. I think that maybe as a subcategory of failure, it's the kind of realm of possibility. And so I think for me, the last couple of years have really been a process of trying to open up some of the rigid ways I had thought about making art. And so I had a period of time where I really thought that I had to make art that was about something and something very specific. And so the idea was concrete before whatever the thing was produced. And then it really became this kind of illustration of whatever this idea was. And I think more and more I'm trying to let go of that, and even things that maybe I don't quite understand, that's okay, and that maybe later there's a possibility to articulate it, and then maybe these things can live on their own, or somebody else can talk about them better than I can. So then, I guess that just maybe in terms of trying to open up.
Right. Humberto?
I don't know. I think in my case, something that'd be like really frustrating, like a big failure, so to speak, would be, I don't know, like maybe like not have any motivation or ideas to do something. You know what I mean? I mean, there's like different stages of the process where you can encounter failure, and different kinds of it. I don't know if you have an idea and then you're just dealing with the medium, and the medium is not like being that good to you, or you know what I mean, like it's just not working out. That can be one problem, but I don't know. In my case, I think that it's not specifically about one type of medium that I can work with, but rather to have like the motivation or an idea to pursue or to work with. That'd be pretty frustrating if I didn't have. I mean, that'd be a terrible day at the studio, or a terrible moment. If I didn't have just the motivation to do something.
Right.
I wanted to add one little thing to that, because I think it's
absolutely.
a great place where he's going that I hadn't really thought about. It's clearly, but ultimately, the greatest failure any of us could have is not making artwork. I mean, that's what it's about. As long as we're making things, it's
I'd
not
say
totally
not
failing.
wanting to.
Or not wanting to, like you're saying, yes,
I think-
not sitting down and doing something, because I've faced that at times. Recently, even I had a month or two of like, I just, it's not, there's no conduit. I'm sitting in front of my computer. What is going on? Things were
Right.
kind of happening, but it was like, and I didn't have the motivation, and it's terrifying. And it's like, that's why if there is a failure, it's I did not make a piece today. I didn't even touch a piece today, because of motivation or whatever. And that is failure. Not making art is failure for an artist.
Yeah.
How could it not be? So yeah.
I think that's how a lot of the collecting practice has come into my daily life, is to subvert that.
Keep it going,
It's like a
yeah.
subversion process, so that, because I get really dark if I can't make anything,
Right.
I get really bummed out, and sometimes I don't even know why. It's like if you're hungry and you don't know that you're hungry, and you're freaking out. I think that's kind of how I feel.
I actually do the same thing. I mean, look at those images. I collect.
Yeah.
I just look at images and just think about
And you can feel a little
images
better,
that-
like even if you are just writing down an idea, or like you just have one memory of one thing, or you just pick up one thing. Like, I think it helps with the continuity of making, so that your studio or your computer isn't cold.
Right.
Yeah, but that is kind of the worst, isn't it?
So Is there something that, and this will be my last question before we open up to question and answer, because I'd like to be able to open this discussion up. We've kind of maybe gotten it going, and I'd really like to engage you guys as well. But is there something that you can impart or talk about within, like, the motivation factor it's in the pursuit of your own practices, how motivation plays a part. And, as you've just said, maybe the whole failure is to not make work. So if you had any words for the students here or anybody here, like in their own practices, of how to stay motivated, and maybe it's not a thing of how, or it's just what kind of gets you back into kind of being reinterested if you've fallen away, or how you keep that connection. You can interpret that however you'd like.
Well, I think we were dancing around it just then.
Yeah.
We were collecting, and with me, it's it still goes back to trust in some way. I have to say that it's not so much about motivation. I spent years dealing with motivation,
Right.
and failure of motivation at times, and flagellating myself for not being motivated enough. And then I realized that there's no universal path or secret path. I had to go back and trust myself again and just say, I'm not going to not make art. I mean, this is what I do. This is who I am. So it is kind of pepping myself up like that at times, but it's also in just a tactile way. It's for me, it's I guess being very critical of everything I see around me. That keeps me going. So as I just walk around, even if I'm not collecting or actively taking photographs or pieces or whatever, it's looking at the world critically, and critically is kind of a loaded word too. I mean, just kind of looking and thinking and making sure my mind is active all the time. It seems like a simple thing, but it's really just not being passive. My greatest fear in that way, and it goes into not making art, is becoming purely a consumer. Because that's one thing I think artists, we do as a whole, is we're producers. It's a simplistic way of looking at it, but it's so easy to consume. My work is very much about consumption. All of ours are in ways. And so I just always have to also tell myself I'm not just a consumer. Whether or not I'm actually producing, I have to look at the world like, how can I respond to this, even when I'm doing nothing but looking, So that's, I guess, how I stay stable and sane.
I think that's so beautifully said. I don't even know how much I can add to that. I see so much of that, and especially in the idea of consuming and what that means to participate in that, and how to stay aware of what we consume and what we bring people's attention to. I think a lot of the work that I brought here has to do with that. But in terms of motivation and trying to think of adding to the sort of collecting practice and the paying attention and keeping my hand kind of in the pot every day, I do some really dorky stuff to stay motivated. I mean, if it's like a perfectly frank conversation where I'm not trying to sound fancy
Artsy.
or theoretical, like I watch Art 21 on like streaming, like I just go, and then if I see something, like these are really nerdy things that I do at home in the morning. If I see something that makes me feel excited, I stop right there and I literally like run to my studio. I look at a lot of art. I love art. I get so excited about art. I'm critical, but I'm a real lover. And I talk to my friends, and I have them into my studio a lot. And I think the thing that I'm still trying to learn how to do is that I hope that I'm always trying to learn how to do is to be really weird, like let the weird out and let myself be embarrassed. And I think that seems, I think I've said that a couple of times already, but I think it's important, and I think that's how people connect to you. So I wouldn't mean to give anybody advice about how to make art, because it's so personal, but it's what I do.
How do you let the weird out, Whitney?
Don't follow with my thoughts to your practice. It doesn't work.
No, I know.
Well, I've been kind of trying to think of how to respond to this because I try to shake off the Catholic guilt as much as possible. And for me, like sometimes it's okay to just go to the beach, and if I don't have ideas, that I've always had an idea after the period when I didn't have any, and then if I never have any again, then I don't know, I'll figure something else out to do. So I don't know if I have advice about motivation. I may think that you have a desire to make or not, but
is there something that motivates you in particular?
Deadlines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That works.
Those are the
Yeah.
best motivators.
Yeah. And then of course, there's those things that you get, and you get this idea that you're really excited about, and that maybe that goes back to when you're asking about how do you know if something's successful or you want to pursue it. And yeah, I think it's if you keep waking up and want to do it, that maybe that's the only gauge that I can think of. But
And Humberto?
I'm just gonna take the liberty to pick up some of the things that you guys have already talked about. I totally agree that you have to keep your eyes open. I mean, you have to be critical and keep them open all the time. You know, just be alert and consume, and conversations and talking to people is also great. You know, and that can trigger a lot of good things, and I don't know, like sometimes the best ideas you can get are from either like talking to your friends, your artist friends, or whoever you want to talk to, and from consuming, like I don't know, like movies or books or whatever. And also about being curious, I think that's something that I would add. I think curiosity is essential. I mean, it's something that you should never lose. I think that's something that fuels, like your creative process.
Fantastic. I'd like to open it up now, if that's okay. We've got Cortney. We have a roving microphone, and for video purposes, I'd really like it if you could speak into it, and also so Humberto can hear you. So is there anyone off the bat, and we can discuss what we've been talking about here. We can also discuss the works in the show as well, and how they kind of fit into this, or not, or just curiosity with the works as well. Bruce?
Yeah, it's just sort of a comment, but for me, failure translates into not done.
What do you think about that panel?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's kind of what I said earlier. If there's not a video on the wall, I failed, So yeah, something not done like that, like it's literally not finished. I think that opens up a whole other can of when is an artwork done, though. Sometimes you fail by not stopping, not realizing it was done a week ago. Why have I beat this horse dead, or whatever. Yeah.
I have a question. What would happen to the art making practice if failure was not in the mix? If failure was not to be considered, if deadlines were not to be considered?
I mean, I think most people have seen that because they have people in their lives who have retired and taken up painting, or who make work that they don't show to anyone, or make work as a practice for pleasure. And I think that that's fine, but there's no critical dialogue, and there's no deadline, there's no one to show it to, and there are none of those things. There's no questioning, and it's not done intentionally. It's not done with a sense of urgency.
I mean, sometimes we have to be saved from ourselves in that sense.
I have a comment about what Cortney said. I think what she described is a recipe for mediocrity in art.
Could you repeat that?
She
She said what I described is a recipe for mediocrity. mediocrity is what you said, yeah, in art.
Possibility for it, sure.
Yeah, if you take failure out of the mix, that then it opens the pool to mediocrity. I'm gonna go here, then here. You can hold it.
And Humberto, you can like interject at any time. Don't feel like we have to address
I have
you.
two questions. One is, if you look at failure, you're setting yourself up for a lot of stress. And when people are usually under a lot of stress, they can't be unabashed in what their creativity would be. It seems to me. I'm a writer. I know that as relaxed as I can be, that's when I really can touch into my innards that can do the expression. But if I'm going to be worrying about what somebody is going to think about what I write, if I'm going to write for a person or for people, I'm probably going to be extremely censored. And I was wondering if that happens to any of you. Do you do your creativity from your innards and get excited about a thought or a feeling or a sensitivity or imagination, or are you doing it to please somebody else so that you're appreciated in some form?
Whitney?
Well, I mean, honestly, it's probably a little bit of both. There's this New Yorker cartoon a while ago that was this woman that was in a pool, and she's holding a painting, and she's swimming with it, and underneath it says, "What good is art if you can't have fun with it?" And I think there's that thing where, yeah, that, I mean, for me, like this, there's this kind of push of, if there's a real pleasure in the idea, and the pleasure isn't just if it's humor or goofy, but if there's something that drives you to continue some sort of process. But then I think for me, context is always so important. And so it's always thinking about what that audience is, what that context is. And so it's not something that's just this individual pursuit, that maybe there's other activities that then don't make it out that way. But yeah, I think it's a little bit of a balance for me.
I think kind of along those lines, I totally agree in my own practice with what you said, but last few years I've done a few commissions here and there, and that's a very different kind of beast in this mix. Someone is hiring you to do something for a space or a theme or something like that, and I have immense fun with those. I actually love maintaining that balance. If I know where it's going and who it's going for, it's pre-bought or whatever, I mean, it's, and maintaining that balance of letting myself be as free as I can while having structure around it and subverting that sometimes too. I've done a couple where I've thrown a few things in that I think they're going to not like to see where boundaries lie or whatever. But I think it can be dangerous if you totally let go of audience and placement. I mean, completely. I personally, if I day-to-day thought, it's not a 50-50 split. It's more like a 90-10 split day-to-day at times, but the audience never goes away. I always know I want this to exist somewhere. So I have to have some expectation of someone's going to see it, So it is that balance. But I do agree that we need to let ourselves go as much as possible.
I mean, I feel like I'm very jealous of your work. We have such opposite approaches. I wish that, I work really well under pressure, and I find that really interesting things happen really late at night in the studio when I'm being pushed to a deadline or to a limit or to a studio visit. And alternately, I really enjoy the community of artists, and I enjoy the process of talking to a curator about a show and having a dialogue with them where you're developing a thought together and you're trying to learn about each other. That's really fun for me. And then because a lot of my work is time-based, there has to be some kind of a deadline. So I actually feel like when I get pushed really hard, I do well. I feel like I have to let go and I have to take risks. and strange things happen because I'm working really hard. So I have to say I totally disagree with you, but I enjoy the difference.
Humberto, do you have anything to add?
Well, I'd probably like to add that that I agree with that. I'm most unproductive when I'm relaxed, I think. But that's okay. I mean, I like to be under some kind of pressure, whether a deadline or, whatever kind of commitment that you might have. That's okay. And then I think that in my case, and I work better that way. I get carried away, and then I start having more ideas. And when I'm not doing anything, it's just like lame. Like just sitting around going like I'm supposed to do something. On the other hand, it's okay to have a clear head and be relaxed when probably reflecting upon your work. And just like thinking about what you're doing. That's also important. And in that case, I mean, not that you don't have to be conscious of what you're doing. You have to be, but at the same time, I think that you have to give yourself some time to think about what you have done, and you know what I mean. And I think that's very important too.
Next question.
A lot of this conversation has been about how failure is something that is inevitable, and I'm just wondering if you guys ever place failure as something that you seek, or like an end goal that allows you to create something that you wouldn't have otherwise created, something that could be original because of like actually seeking failure and understanding your practice and going against that to explore different things.
Creating obstacles for themselves?
Yeah.
Or subverting expectations.
Are you saying like intending to fail?
Intending to fail.
Like beginning a work with the intention of falling flat on your face?
So this might be like a redefinition of the expectations that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's very tricky, because I guess still in my definition of something about is if I make something, I didn't fail. I might have stumbled along the way, but so, when I hear that, it's like I set out to not make something, and therefore I'm not doing anything. So it's kind of, I can't really, I've set myself up to challenge myself, but I never think of it as failure, because I hope something comes out of it. I mean, I fully realize at any moment I might abandon a piece, but there was always something there. I've never started something that I didn't glean something from, so I never thought anything was a total failure unless nothing was made. You know what I mean? But I think it's good if you're going in the way of setting yourself up challenges and like, let me make something I've never made, or is that possible even to do? That's important. It's risk taking, sure. I don't know, what do you guys think about that?
I'd be interested in the way you work.
Well, with Whitney, I think with what you were talking about before, with the performance and coming up with different expectations, or just having like a set of expectations that don't necessarily go to like some sort of idealized completed product, but to set up these places of engagement.
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't think the snow shelter, I really didn't think we were going to be able to make it. And so I came out here with trying to figure out then how we would talk about it once we made a pile of slush. And so then when it started to work, it was actually this kind of rug pulled with that. But I don't know, I mean, I think thinking about other artists too that maybe set out to do a task that they know that they can't, that they talked about, like there's the image of Chris Burden with the gun pointed at the 747. And there's no intention for him to actually shoot the plane. It's about that creation of the image. And so I don't know if that's failure or if it's this coming short of what the attempt is. But I don't know if that's what you were thinking about or not.
I was thinking more like in process. Hold on, Peter. Sorry. We can't make them work a lot. I was just thinking like in process, do you ever recognize failure coming and embrace it before it happens?
I understand failure. I mean, the meaning of failure that you're talking about sounds more to me like risk, than failure. Like challenging yourself, but not aiming to fail. That's the way I look at it. I don't know if that's what you're, trying to. I don't know if that's what your question is about, though.
Well, to complete a failure would be a success.
Right.
Right.
I mean, I think the idea of setting out a problem for yourself to solve where you're like, today I'm going to make something that fails, I think that's really like kind of punk rock and kind of like anachronistic and like, right. I mean, I think it's kind of amazing. I hope that you do that. I think some of the ways that you've kind of couched the question as you've made some follow-up statements have more to do with some of Barrett's initial questions about managing failure and some of the things that Barry has said about paying attention. So let's say in my case, I make a mold for something and I cast the mold and it comes out broken. And then it's about the experience that I've had and the work that I've made and paying attention and being on and being critical. Do I look at that broken thing and consider it as an object that's been produced and brought into the world, and can I do something with this? Like, do I throw it away? I'll probably let it sit for a couple of days. But I don't think that I've ever been ballsy enough or angry enough at myself to start out with a work and say, I'm going to make something just god-awful on purpose.
What
that
about
fails.
the stool?
No, I had the best of intentions. I had the best. And sometimes there's that moment where you think you're really cooking.
We have time for a few more questions, so if Courtney could, yes.
So I have a question directed towards Barry, but I think everyone can kind of get in on it. But I'm curious, being far away from that graduate school critique about the pigeon piece,
right.
How do you recognize the pigeon piece on your own at this point in your artistic practice?
You mean how do I accept it for what?
No, how do you see the thing that you were doing that's really good that you weren't out seeking out to do, that kind of is on the periphery of what you're doing, but is the thing that's really good?
Oh, I think that's, yeah. I think this goes not just that piece, but me and maybe you guys too, as an evolution of an artist, is that I usually am ahead of myself without knowing it, meaning if I'm really intuitive, I'm really just making work. This goes sometimes, the failures are ones that I can't see clearly enough of that's my next step. And I think with that particular piece, the thing that people gravitated to is the humor. But when I was making it, I was wanting to be dead serious. So that was one of the things I wasn't seeing quite the same, as I wasn't seeing it as funny as a lot of people were and as tongue-in-cheek. But I realized that it was actually years later, I wanted to embrace more humor. And that was one of those things. So that's how I came to terms with that piece. And I try as much as I can to always be a bit open-minded about that, especially if someone is saying, we love this piece and I don't see it. I do step back and say, why? Directly asking them maybe, and if they can answer it, if I'm there with them, or just trying to really reevaluate the work. Sometimes it takes years for me. I just still go back and some of the things where I go, God, I love this work. This is the best work I've ever made. 5 years later, I'm going, what the hell was I thinking? Now the work today is the best work I ever made. So it's that kind of continuum. That's where I still keep saying I have to let myself go. I have to just say I make art and trust it and be as critical and as focused as I can, but just say I'm going to, it has its own light. There is a great quote about that somewhere. It's like just letting it go. Soon as it leaves your hands, you have nothing whatsoever to do with it anymore, no responsibility, nothing. It's in the world. Yeah.
One more question?
Yes, I'm not sure who I would direct this to. Sort of segues off a previous question, but there seems to be a strange philosophical disconnect between intent and failure here. I'm having a little hard time understanding how when your intention is completely different than the response that you may get from an audience or a gallery or whatever, how you reconcile your intent being so different and yet it being perceived as either a success or a failure when you see it as neither or either.
Humberto?
But what you're arguing here is that there's a difference between what you intend to do and then the result, what comes out of it, or?
Yeah, I think so. If you intend to do one thing and you're applauded for doing something you never intended to do,
okay.
how do you reconcile that, and how do you measure that as success or failure? How do you do that? Because I think for most artists, what we intend is what gives us that thrill, what we want to do, why we push ourselves, why we take risks. And if we get something back that's the opposite of that, how do you reconcile?
I actually think that Dave points out something interesting, because he acknowledges that the artist is the one that is in control of all of his surroundings, right? Yes. But that's not always the case. Sometimes the artist enters into negotiation with materials, right? I agree with that too, yes. So in that negotiation, how can one take the intent? How can one relate to the intent there? If you're in negotiation with other things that have their own rules, or.
I understand that. And by the way, negotiating with the materials or negotiating with the process has never been perplexing to me, but negotiating with the response to what I have done as an artist is, I think that's really pithy. And maybe there's no answer to this, but it's a good problem. Maybe that's all it is.
I'll take a quick shot at it. I think it is really tricky, and I think that with at least me, sometimes it is case by case. I will go on some limb and tell you about like hurt feelings in a way. Like, do I get like hurt by why this is the best? Why aren't you seeing it? That kind of thing, or whatever. But it took me a while to figure this out, and I own it now. Is I want people to have a response. I want to show my work, but at the same time, why I make work is about the process and the discovery and the I forgot how Humberto put it, but the sense of wonder or the curiousness. It's that is ultimately what it's about for me. And so in that, I just have to let it go. Art, I grew up, my first semester in undergrad, I had a professor who did believe that art was totally objective. Good art is good art, and everyone should know it's good art. Bad art is bad art. Everyone should know it's bad art. And I never subscribed to that, and I still don't. Not everything's for everyone. Not everyone, because that implies that we are the sole providers of the process. That we come up with an idea, we make an object, we dictate its function, its response, and all of that. And I don't believe that. The public is intelligent. You all bring different responses, different backgrounds and all that. You see things I didn't see and I didn't intend, good and bad. The flip side could be I make this piece and someone sees an image in it that is really, reviles them or something, and I never saw it. But so it fails for them totally, and I'm innocently like I never kind of saw that in there. So I believe it is totally reciprocal. I'm wanting to communicate, I'm wanting to explore and share that with an audience, and then they are going to come at it how they come at it. Hopefully, I have enough history and that usually there's a good kind of relationship, but if it fails, it fails, and I can't always own that too much.
I think I think that's really well said, and I think it's interesting in the context of a conversation about repurposing objects that are out in the world, that you can't control the way that a certain person might have interacted with a certain object or a certain color or a certain reference. And I think that I think your question is really interesting, and I'm glad that you opened up a more philosophical sort of aspect to the conversation instead of being just so studio practice based. But I definitely feel like for me, I embrace the complexity of life and of people, and I'm interested in people, and I feel like for the way that I work, it would be some sort of a God complex to think that I could come up with an idea, know exactly what the end result was going to be, get there, put it out into the world, and expect people to respond to it exactly the way I intended. I don't really feel like that's what the process of communication or life is about.
Whitney or Humberto, do you have a response or any closing statements?
I pretty much think that if that problem didn't exist, just art, it wouldn't exist at all. That's what art is about, you know? I mean, otherwise you'd be like in total control of everything, and that's not interesting, I think.
Yeah, I mean,
or maybe it is, I don't know. For some.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing of that problem of intentions and readings. And yeah, I've been just trying to think about those kind of gaps. I mean, I did a project with a rabbit, and there was a lot of people who read it as, I was approaching it very formally, I thought, and then people were getting into that the bunny was cute, or some people thought I was torturing it. And I think there was, that was definitely one thing that I'm still trying to understand, how I conceived this thing started to veer off in other places. But then I was thinking about, I think probably my work of art I think of most often is Walter de Maria's Lightning Field. And when you go out there, you have to spend the night you're there for 24 hours, and one of the things is that there's 3 rooms there, and so you have to stay with strangers if anybody wanted to go that particular night. And so being stuck in a cabin out in the middle of nowhere with strangers was a really frightening prospect that I hadn't considered that I was going to enter into when I went to go see this work. And so there was all these sort of social things that started to happen and unfold as I was there that I don't think Walter de Maria preconceived. I think it was later when the Dia Foundation took it over, but it was something that was still really interesting, part of that experience. So I don't know that it becomes part of the work, and for me, just thinking of how that can be allowed. And then other times, yeah, that maybe it is that failure of communication. I think there's a movie, isn't there, like, this is a failure to communicate? I don't know what that is.
Is it Network?
I don't know.
I think it's Network.
I think it's a military movie, yeah.
We've unfortunately run over time, but I'd really like to thank you, and I'd really like to thank this last comment, because I think that this really touches on what will be following the rest of the spring series, and that this negotiation of intention and what the artists have just provided us with as an answer goes back to kind of how I started off by framing this with practice as a definition of practice not necessarily being what the individual intends, nor its product, that it's instead this very like almost hyperactive relationship between the two, and perhaps the audience as well, is that it's the ingredient without neither the activity nor the product would exist at all. So I would like to thank you all for coming and to bringing us around to understanding practice and failure and how it comes all together. And thank you all for being here. And I hope you fail more and fail better, as Beckett would say.